Hello and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be tackling a job that I've been looking forward to with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. That is an engine rebuild for my 87 CBR 1000. So what happened, I'd noticed that it was starting to smell a little oily. Had gunned it off a light back when the bike was on the road a couple of years back. And a friend of mine had a laugh from the giant cloud of oily smoke that poured out of the exhaust pipes. So we're pretty confident we got a worn ring kind of situation here. Confirmed by the compression test. We ran a compression test on it, and cylinder 3 showed very low compression. We put a little bit of oil in the cylinder and the compression came up. So that's another indicator of worn rings. The bike itself has 60,000 kilometers on it. I guess that'd be about 40,000 miles. So it's definitely in need of a refresh at this point. Yeah, so we're going to take the top end off, start with the valves, cylinder, obviously do the rings, and we'll go down unless I change my mind. We're going to go into the crankcase, do the main bearings, and a Conrod small end bearings as well. So it's going to be a pretty big job. I don't know how many videos this is going to be or how useful it's going to be. But I will say, if you're considering doing this job yourself, definitely want to make sure you got a service manual. I got a service manual as well as a Haynes. I actually like to have both. The service manual tends to be definitely written for a technician, which is good. It's not a lot of verbiage, it's not reading a lot of paragraphs or full sentences. It tends to just be instructions, remove carburetors, remove airbox, drain coolant system. It's going to assume that you have the prior knowledge or understanding of how to do those things. It's just going to tell you what order to do them. But the Haynes is actually useful because it does provide a little bit more of a narrative view, or a narrative explanation of how you would do certain things. And it's come in handy with a couple of little quirks on the bike in the past, where service manual tells you how to do something, but maybe it's not as simple as it appears, or that sort of thing. So yeah, let's get started. So here's kind of a view of what I would consider the essential tools for the job would be. Obviously you need your hand tools, you need ratchets, sockets in a variety of sizes. It is quicker if you have one of these. I like to use these for disassembly specifically. If you're doing engine work, you don't want to use this for reassembly. Just as a rule, you can't really tell how much torque it's putting on, and it can strip these little, tiny little 6mm bolts pretty quickly. But it is handy for disassembly, especially motor mounts, that sort of thing. We are going to need torque wrenches. Most of the work we're going to be doing is you can use the 3/8 torque wrench. Depending on the range of it, you may need to use the 1/2-inch torque wrench for certain jobs. Again, pliers, picks, that sort of thing. As far as lubricants, we're going to use some assembly lube, various points. We're going to need some valve grinding compound. It's going to be a specific function when we go to lap the valves in. Got our permatex gasket maker. We're also going to need thread locker. This is the blue. We're also going to need the red, strictly for the cam sprockets, I think, take the red. But again, refer to your manual. Pliers, we need snap ring pliers here as well. Trim clips, picks, other sort of implements to get into some awkward situations there. Here's our valve lapping tool. I always swear by one of these. I don't want to recommend anyone use a drill. But we'll get to that point. We'll have plenty of time to cover that off. This is a valve spring compressor that I made out of a wood clamp. Obviously it's probably going to make more sense just go buy your own, or rent one out of value or whatever else. I think they rent them for next to free. But I was feeling lazy and had the tools, so I just built that. This is a piston ring compressor. This again is going to be useful for disassembly. It's just a little impact screwdriver. Don't want to use that on reassembly. And yeah, got penetrating fluid. Want to use this sparingly, especially within the engine itself. Solvents, generally speaking, not super great. You can use them obviously for things that are coming fully apart and being completely serviced. But you generally want to avoid contact between this and your engine oil. We've got brake cleaner. This stuff's good because it degreases, but it doesn't leave behind a residue. Got our little oil can here, and Yeah, so as far as measurement tools, we're going to need V-blocks as well as a runout gauge. We're going to use that to measure runout on the camshafts and maybe the crank. I don't think my setup's going to be anywhere. I don't think it's going to be large enough to measure the crank, first of all. But we'll see if we can. As the bike's only got 60,000 miles on it, and it wasn't a catastrophic failure, so I'm not expecting deflection in the crank. But it's better to know, I guess. If you're going to take it apart anyway, you may as well get a good look inside of it. And then for other measurement tools, we have our trusty digital calipers. Say trusty with air quotes. This is an ish tool. It's pretty good for getting you close. But to get a really fine measurement, you definitely want to use either a micrometer or bore gauges. The bore gauges we're going to use to measure the bore of the cylinders. And that measures essentially that interval there. And then the micrometer is essentially the inverse, where it can measure the exact width of a part. Going to need our feeler gauges as well. And yeah, so nothing too fancy. Certainly none of these tools would qualify as fancy. Basic stuff, kind of. Now the first thing we need to do is get the bike good and naked. Remove the fairings, gas tank, throttle cables, choke cables, spark plug wires, and ignition coils. Drain the cooling system and remove the radiator, thermostat housing, and any hoses that will get in the way. Unhook the fuel line and remove the carburetors and airbox. The carburetors can be pretty crusty and may be difficult to remove. Just be patient and be careful not to damage them. We don't have to remove the airbox, but it'll give us better access, especially to this motor mount underneath, and I wanted to clean it up anyway. Now I like to label these miscellaneous drain vacuum lines to assist with reassembly. A recurring theme of this series is going to be how important it is to stay organized. Trust me, it's important. Next, we can remove the hose leading to the water pump and the water pipes on the cylinder head, noting that the left water pipe has a small hose that leads back down to the water pump. Next, we drain the oil and remove the oil pipes on the front of the engine. I've left the oil filter on for now just to try to contain the mess. We can take that off later, doesn't matter. And moving up, we can remove this radiator bracket and loosen off the water pipes. Now we can get to the meat of it. Remove the valve cover, being careful not to damage the reusable gasket. And from this point on, try to minimize the amount of dust and debris entering the engine. Try to make sure that no fasteners or other parts fall into the crankcase. It's not going to be impossible to retrieve them, but it's not always easy. Now we can remove the 4 bolts securing the cam chain cover and carefully remove it as well. Now to remove the cylinder head, we need to remove the camshafts. The first step to camshaft removal is to remove the cam sprockets. So we need to look down at the engine cover on the right lower side of the bike, remove that small plate, and rotate the engine using a 14mm socket until the timing marks line up. And at that point, the upper camshaft sprocket fasteners will be accessible. Now these are held on with red Loctite and can be a real struggle to remove. So we remove the 2 upper cam sprocket bolts, and then we can rotate the engine to access the lower cam sprocket bolts. Obviously remove those also. And we'll start with the intake cam. Slide the cam sprocket off its shoulders, and next we'll have to loosen the camshaft retainers. Make sure to unbolt these in 2 to 3 stages in a crisscross pattern to prevent warpage. I like to start with a quarter turn on each bolt, go back, do another quarter turn, and then go up to a full turn. And some of them will feel tighter than others just because of the way the camshafts can be pressing down on certain of the rockers, but not others. But by the time you go up to a full turn, they should be slack and can be run out by hand. Now we remove the cam retainers themselves. The force of the valve springs will want to jam these against the cams, so push down by hand, and once they straighten out, they should pop right off. Now do be careful, note the alignment pins and ensure that they don't get lost or fall into the crankcase. And once that's done, we can lift the cam up and slide it out the side, and remove the cam sprocket obviously as well. And removal of the exhaust camshaft is achieved by the same process. Now before we forget, ensure that the alignment pins and O-rings for the cam bearing oil passages are removed. This is a bit of a neat detail. I haven't actually seen this before in my limited experience taking motorcycle engines apart. But the oil is actually pumped through these passages, up through the cam retainers, and jetted onto the bearing surfaces from above. For weight savings, I assume most modern sport bike engines use a drilled cam with oil sloshing around on the inside. And so that's kind of neat. The other thing you never see on modern sport bikes are rocker arms with adjustable valves. On the plus side, valve jobs are super easy and the components are much easier to access. You don't have to remove the cams to adjust the valves, whereas if it's a shim under bucket, as basically all sport bikes are these days, you have to take the cams every time you need to adjust the valves. But the drawbacks of the rocker arms are weight, cost, performance, and shorter adjustment intervals. So shim under bucket tends to be the superior system, and I ain't gonna fight that. But this was the fastest bike of its day, and little details like this I just think is kind of neat to show just how refined the modern sport bike formula has become in the 30 years since this was new. Now for the next stage of disassembly, we're going to want to make sure to put a piece of stout wire around this cam chain here. Just don't want that falling down into the crankcase. Now we can go ahead and loosen the 4 bolts holding the cam chain tensioner in place. Now the cam chain tensioner comes out as an assembly with this chain guide. So in order to remove that, you will need to remove the 2 cotter pins. And again, just be careful that these clips don't go flying off somewhere where you can't find them, or certainly not into the crankcase. And if you haven't already, this is a good time to take out your spark plugs. Now we can finally start to loosen the cylinder head nuts and as well as the 4 studs that hold the cylinder head onto the cylinder. Again, you want to loosen these in the crisscross pattern, starting from the outside in 2 or 3 stages. If you don't do this, if you, for example, just went on this with an impact and just ran it off, you would run the risk of warping your head, which sounds about as expensive as you would think. So yeah, take your time, be meticulous. You'll see me here, I'm being pretty meticulous. Now you would think with all the cylinder head bolts loosened that we'd be ready to move this from the bike. Unfortunately for this model, we need to actually tilt the engine back. We don't have clearance to get it out from the frame. So what we need to do is we need to support the engine, and we need to remove all the motor mounts except for the pivoting bolt, pivoting motor mount, which is on the upper rear of the engine, right near the starter. Now we need to remove the heat shields on the left and right side of the engine. As well, if your rear tire is still on the bike, make sure to loosen the chain adjuster before you jack up the engine. Now once all the other motor mounts are removed, we can loosen the pivoting motor mount. And the way we do that, it's actually a lock nut system. So you need to break the lock nut free and then go in and run in the other nut until you've got a little bit of a gap between the engine and the frame. And that will allow it to pivot up and down. Now this actually takes a 23 millimeter fastener. So I don't actually own a 23 millimeter wrench. I had to use a nut rounder, and so I apologize for that. Now with everything ready to go, we can jack up the engine a little bit and you'll see it start to pivot upwards, and that'll give us enough room to get the cylinder head free. Now as we start to pull the cylinder head off the bike, just be aware there's a couple of alignment pins that may or may not fall out as you're doing this, as well as a gasket underneath the cylinder head, obviously. Now we can move the cylinder head and cylinders off to the bench here. Now you see this is a nice clean bench I've kept aside. You don't want to be mixing projects up on a bench, so I've got this bench dedicated. It's only going to be for this engine rebuild. And you see I got some things to help me keep organized. I've got a small box which is going to be perfect for holding the valves, as well as a couple of egg cartons and other little parts trays. And this is going to tie back to the organization thing, especially when we start taking the valve train apart. There's a lot of parts that need to be matched to each other. So in the next episode, we're going to dive into the valve train, going to do some inspection and service, make sure our camshafts and bearing surfaces are all in good shape. Going to clean up the valves and as well as the cylinder head itself, check for warpage and some other good stuff. In the meantime, thanks for watching.